On March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines flight MH370 lifted off from Kuala Lumpur International Airport just after midnight. It was a routine flight bound for Beijing, a path the airline had flown countless times before. The crew in the cockpit were experienced. The Boeing 777 was one of the most reliable aircraft in the sky, and the weather was calm. There was no reason to believe this flight would be any different from the thousands of others that connected Southeast Asia to China every week. For the first 40 minutes, everything went smoothly. The plane climbed to its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Controllers in Kuala Lumpur were in constant contact with the pilots, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Passengers were likely dozing off, watching movies, or quietly settling in for the overnight flight. Inside the cockpit, the pilots carried out the routine checklist and prepared for the handoff to Vietnamese airspace. At exactly 1:19 a.m., the last confirmed words came through the radio. "Good night, Malaysian 370.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
The voice was calm, almost casual, the kind of phrase you'd expect to hear from any flight crew at the end of a long shift. Seconds later, the aircraft crossed out of Malaysian-controlled skies. By 1:21 a.m., its transponder signal, the electronic beacon that identifies a plane-to-air traffic radar, shut off. To the air traffic controllers watching their screens, the blip representing MH370 simply vanished. At first, there was no alarm. Planes occasionally disappear temporarily from civilian radar during transitions between regions. Usually, they reappear moments later under the new airspace authority. But when Vietnamese controllers tried to contact the crew, there was nothing. No acknowledgement. No radio chatter. Just silence. As the minutes dragged on, what should have been a routine handoff turned into something unsettling. Efforts to reach the crew continued, but the radio stayed quiet. In modern aviation, this is extremely rare. Commercial aircraft are built with multiple redundant systems, including automated safety features that continue to broadcast a signal even if pilots are incapacitated. For both the transponder and the communication system to stop at almost the same time raised immediate questions. Was it a technical failure? A deliberate shutdown? Or something even worse? Those 2 minutes, from the moment the pilots said good night to the moment the plane effectively disappeared, remain some of the most heavily scrutinized in aviation history. Investigators later admitted it was not just unusual, but nearly impossible for such a large and modern aircraft to vanish without so much as a distress call. In aviation disasters, even when pilots don't have time to speak, the aircraft's automated systems often continue transmitting. Yet MH370 was suddenly invisible, as if someone had reached into the cockpit and flipped a switch. For the families of the passengers, that silence became unbearable. A single radio call, a single word, even a hint of what went wrong might have changed everything. But there was nothing. Just a calm farewell from the captain, followed by a void that still hasn't been explained. That gap, those 2 minutes of silence, marked the beginning of one of the greatest mysteries the modern world has ever faced. The phrase, "Good night, Malaysian 370, has been repeated so many times over the years that it's become almost iconic, the line that marked the moment before the plane slipped into mystery. But what many people don't realize is that those words have been the subject of debate, suspicion, and endless scrutiny ever since they were first reported. The official record states that at 1:19 a.m., the captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah, responded to Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control as the flight prepared to enter Vietnamese airspace. It was supposed to be routine. Controllers had just instructed MH370 to switch to the frequency for Ho Chi Minh City Center, the normal handoff procedure when a plane leaves one country's skies and enters another's. Instead of using the formal phrase Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh on 120.9, good night, the pilot simply said, "Good night, Malaysian 370. On the surface, it's a small detail. Many pilots don't stick to textbook phrasing every time. But for investigators combing through every second of that night, the choice of words raised eyebrows. Was it just casual, or was it a sign that something unusual was already happening in the cockpit? Vietnamese air traffic controllers expected the plane to check in within seconds. That's the standard, one handoff, one response. But MH370 never made contact. Within a minute of that final transmission, its transponder was switched off, and the aircraft stopped sending signals to civilian radar. To many experts, that timing is chilling. It suggests the crew, or someone else in the cockpit, deliberately shut the systems down right after saying goodnight. Over the years, rumors have circulated about what was actually said. Some early reports claimed the final words were, "All right, good night." Later, Malaysian officials corrected this to the simpler, "Good night, Malaysian 370." That change, though seemingly minor, fueled speculation. Why was there inconsistency in such a critical detail? Was it a genuine correction, or an attempt to manage what investigators were willing to reveal? For the families, these debates were agonizing. Imagine being told that the last known words of your loved one's flight might have been misreported, or worse, edited before release. For aviation experts, the issue wasn't just semantics. The exact wording can reveal the mental state of the pilots, whether they were relaxed, rushed, or under stress. If there was hesitation or deviation, it could mean more than anyone admitted. What makes it even more suspicious is how those words fit into the broader timeline. If the captain knew something was wrong, why wouldn't he mention it? If the crew was in distress, why no hint of it in their voice? And if nothing was wrong, then how do we explain the fact that within 120 seconds of that farewell, the plane effectively disappeared? That one short phrase, 11 words in total, is the line separating normal flight from one of the greatest mysteries in history. And it remains one of the biggest questions in the case. Were those final words simply routine, or were they the calm before a storm we still don't fully understand? When investigators can't recover a plane, they at least expect to recover the black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and the flight data recorder, FDR. These devices are the heart of every crash investigation. They're built like tanks, designed to withstand intense heat, crushing pressure, and months underwater. In countless other tragedies, from Air France Flight 447 in the Atlantic to Lion Air Flight 610 in Indonesia, black boxes have told the story that victims never could. But with MH370, the most vital clue in aviation was never officially recovered. Or so we've been told. The official narrative is that despite the largest and most expensive search in aviation history, spanning years and costing over $200 million, no black box from MH370 has ever been found. That fact alone has fueled more conspiracy theories than almost anything else. How does a Boeing 777, one of the most advanced planes of its era, vanish without a trace, and with it the two devices designed specifically to survive the unthinkable? Over the years, whispers began to circulate that fragments of MH370's black box data might have been intercepted. Some investigators claim that satellites picked up bursts of audio or telemetry signals during the plane's final hours, suggesting at least partial transmissions from the recorders. Others insist that intelligence agencies quietly analyzed this information but chose not to make it public. Why the secrecy? Theories range from simple embarrassment to outright cover-ups. Some experts believe the Malaysian government feared admitting to lapses in radar coverage or air defense capabilities. Others suspect that if the black box data pointed to hijacking, sabotage, or even military involvement, releasing it could cause international conflict. Adding to the mystery are accounts from a handful of journalists who claim to have heard snippets of leaked audio. They describe muffled cockpit sounds, alarms, a possible argument between voices, and what sounded like breathing close to the microphone. If true, that would mean someone had access to at least part of the cockpit voice recording, raising the question of why the world hasn't heard it. For families, this is the most painful part of the story. The black boxes are supposed to be the truth tellers, the devices that cut through rumor and speculation. If MH370s were destroyed, it would be a cruel twist of fate. But if they exist, sitting in a government vault or military archive, then withholding them feels like denying justice to 239 people who never made it home. And so the black box became more than just a missing object. It became a symbol of MH370 itself, something that should have been impossible to lose, but that somehow slipped into shadow, leaving behind only fragments, rumors, and 1,000 unanswered questions. For years, the public was told there was nothing unusual to hear from MH370. No mayday calls, no distress signals, just routine radio chatter before silence. But whispers of leaked black box recordings told a different story, one that was far darker and harder to process. According to those who claimed to have heard fragments of the cockpit voice data, what happened in those final minutes was not calm, not controlled, and certainly not ordinary. One investigator described faint alarms in the background, the kind that signal something is wrong with the aircraft's systems. Another claimed to hear heavy breathing, close to the cockpit microphone, almost as if someone was trying to stay calm under intense stress. Most chilling of all were reports of muffled voices, a back-and-forth exchange that sounded like an argument between at least two people. To aviation experts, this detail mattered. A hijacking? A struggle inside the cockpit? Or perhaps the pilots themselves disagreeing on how to handle a situation spiraling out of control. Whatever the truth, it painted a picture far removed from the official narrative of a routine handoff followed by silence. There are even claims that the leaked audio included faint background noises of movement, a clatter, maybe a struggle, before the sound cut abruptly. If true, that would line up with theories that someone either forced their way into the cockpit or that a desperate fight broke out between crew members. Skeptics argue that no such audio could exist, since the black box was never found. But others point out that in modern aviation, multiple systems, including satellites and maintenance relays, can capture fragments of communication. Even if the black box sank to the bottom of the ocean, parts of its final moments might still have been transmitted elsewhere. For families of the passengers, hearing that investigators or intelligence agencies might have listened to these sounds in private but refused to release them was devastating. Imagine being told that your loved one's final minutes may have been recorded, that the truth is sitting on a hard drive somewhere, and yet you're not allowed to hear it. The pain of uncertainty cuts deeper than any single answer. The supposed existence of those disturbing sounds raises questions that haunt investigators to this day. If they were real, why haven't they been made public? Were they too inconclusive, too messy, too shocking? Or was it easier, for governments, for airlines, for the industry itself, to maintain the story of silence rather than admit that the passengers and crew of MH370 may have lived through a terrifying ordeal before the plane finally disappeared from the sky? One of the most puzzling details from the rumored cockpit recordings is the suggestion of a voice that didn't belong. Aviation experts who claim to have heard fragments describe two sets of voices they expected, the captain and the first officer, but also mention something stranger, what sounded like a third voice inside the cockpit. For anyone who knows how commercial flights work, this is alarming. The cockpit door is reinforced, locked from the inside, and closely monitored. After September 11th, protocols were tightened worldwide. Nobody gets inside unless the crew lets them in. So if a third voice really was there, it meant only two possibilities: either someone forced their way inside, or someone was already there when the flight took off. Some analysts speculate this could have been a hijacker. If the plane was indeed taken, this would explain why the transponder was switched off so quickly, why radio contact ceased, and why the aircraft veered off its original path. Others suggest it could have been a crew member not officially assigned to the flight, perhaps deadheading, an industry term for pilots hitching a ride in uniform. That would make sense in theory, but records don't show any extra crew listed on MH370. The darker possibility is that the third voice was not there with permission at all. Investigators have long debated whether someone tampered with the cockpit door, either before takeoff or during the flight. A breach at 35,000 feet is nearly impossible, but not entirely if planned in advance. What makes the idea of a strange voice so haunting is how it fits into other parts of the case. If a third person was in the cockpit, that might explain reports of muffled arguments. It could explain why alarms were sounding but no emergency call was made. Perhaps the pilots weren't in control anymore. It could even account for the eerie precision of the flight's diversion, as if someone else was at the controls. Of course, skeptics dismiss this theory outright. They argue that background interference or overlapping radio frequencies could have created the illusion of another voice. But for the families, the thought that someone might have been inside the cockpit with their loved ones is a nightmare that refuses to fade. The third voice detail may never be confirmed publicly, but it lingers as one of the strangest and most unsettling threads in the entire MH370 mystery. Because if that voice was real, it changes everything, transforming the disappearance from a tragic accident into something much more deliberate and much more terrifying. In any plane crash investigation, timing is everything. Investigators piece together events down to the second using radar, satellite data, black box recordings, and radio transmissions to reconstruct the story of what happened. But with MH370, the timeline has holes, entire minutes where nobody can say for certain what was happening inside that cockpit. Those missing minutes are some of the most heavily debated in aviation history. The first gap comes right after the final radio call, "Good night, Malaysian 370." Within just 2 minutes, the plane's transponder went dark. Normally, that should be the moment when alarms blare across aviation systems. But strangely, for several minutes afterward, nothing seemed to happen. Controllers in Malaysia assumed the aircraft had checked in with Vietnam, while Vietnam waited for MH370 to call in. Both sides hesitated, and that hesitation gave the situation room to grow into disaster. Later, when fragments of satellite data were analyzed, experts realized there may have been attempts, faint signals, sometimes called handshakes, between the aircraft and communication satellites during the period when the plane was officially missing. These signals suggested the aircraft was still flying, still active, and perhaps still under someone's control. But the strange part is how inconsistent they were, with stretches of silence followed by brief, unexplained bursts of connection. Then there's the most chilling gap, the black box recordings. Cockpit voice recorders typically capture the last 2 hours of audio, cycling over older data with new. But the supposed leaks that surfaced, the muffled alarms, the heavy breathing, the arguments, all seem to cut off before the critical final descent. Why would the last few minutes, the moment of impact or disappearance, be absent? Was it a technical failure? Or, as some suggest, was that section deliberately withheld? For families and independent investigators, these missing minutes feel like deliberate blind spots. If the recordings cut off right when the plane needed explaining most, it's hard not to suspect tampering. If satellites picked up signals but they weren't shared publicly, it raises questions about what governments know but aren't saying. The tragedy of MH370 isn't just about a lost plane, it's about uncertainty. In disasters, closure comes from knowing when and how things happened. With MH370, the missing minutes ensure that closure never arrives. They leave families imagining their loved ones in those gaps. Were they alive? Were they terrified? Were they fighting to survive? The unanswered timeline has become more than an investigative problem. It's a wound that never closes because silence in those missing minutes doesn't just hide facts. It hides the truth of what really happened on that flight. The disappearance of MH370 wasn't just another case for investigators. It was unlike anything they had faced before. Crash investigators are used to dealing with wreckage, hard evidence, and data they can piece together like a puzzle. But with MH370, the first challenge was the absence of evidence. No wreckage, no survivors, no clear crash site. And then came the whispers of leaked cockpit recordings, fragments of sound that, if true, shook even the most hardened analysts. One account describes investigators listening to what sounded like the faint background of passengers in distress, voices overlapping in multiple languages, prayers, crying, the unmistakable sound of panic. To people who spend their careers dissecting aviation disasters, the human element can often be the hardest part. But this was different. This was evidence, however incomplete, that the final moments of MH370 were not calm, not quick, but drawn out and chaotic. Another insider spoke about hearing what they described as a struggle in the cockpit, raised voices, maybe even shouting, before the feed cut abruptly. If true, it pointed to something much darker than mechanical failure, a possible hijacking, sabotage, or a fight for control of the aircraft. For some investigators, it was simply too much. According to reports, at least one member of the analysis team walked out of the room when the audio was first reviewed, unable to continue listening. These are professionals who've studied some of the most tragic air disasters in history, and yet the alleged MH370 recording left them visibly shaken. The shock wasn't just emotional, it was professional. If those sounds were authentic, they exposed a huge gap in the official story. For years, the public was told the disappearance was clean, with no distress calls or chaos. But the leaked audio suggested the opposite, that there was confusion, fear, and conflict in the final moments. The idea that such critical information might have been withheld or minimized was disturbing for investigators who pride themselves on transparency and accuracy. It also raised an ethical question: should the world hear these recordings? On one hand, they might provide closure for families and finally answer the what happened question. On the other, broadcasting the final terrified moments of passengers and crew could be seen as cruel, sensational, or even exploitative.